The S-Class was the fastest express engine produced by VR. They were destined to be preserved, but unfortunately, they were all scrapped in 1954. The scrapping of these marvelous machines led to the creation of the ARHS Museum at Newport. This is the Victorian S-Class, one of the fastest express engines in Australia. The S-Class was designed to eliminate the need for double heading on express trains, such as the distance from Melbourne to Albury. They were designed by Alfred E. Smith, who was responsible or closely tied to most of the other steam engines running on VR at the time. One was produced in-house at Newport in 1928 as a prototype, numbered S300. Two more were produced in 1929, S301 and S302, and a final one was produced in 1930, numbered S303. At the time of construction, they were the largest locos built in Australia, and they had the largest boilers in the Southern Hemisphere. They were a 462 Pacific type. They spent most of their time on the Northeastern Line, running Albury services. In March of 1928, S300 hauled the first ever revenue-earning service from Melbourne to Seymour, hauling 10 E-type carriages, up to 1 in 50 gradient with no assistance. But they were also planned to be used on the overland, as shown in VR's annual report, with about 4 more S-Classes to be built. But the Great Depression hindered those plans. The new logos garnered a lot of public attention, and S300 was put on display at Flinders Street to raise money for the Shrine of Remembrance. Although the class only had 4 members, they were restricted to one line on the network. They were extensively used, and by 1929, they were doing the work of 5 A2s. And in 1936, they were averaging around 90,000 kilometers per year, with S303 setting the record for the most distance traveled in a year, with a staggering 127,800 kilometers per year. With the introduction of the newer locos, older locos would be withdrawn, and the S-Class withdrew several of the older A2 classes. The Great Depression forced the S-Classes out of service and onto goods trains in 1931. This was criticized as Victorian Railways' flagship leading express engine on a slow-moving goods train. The S-Classes also displaced X-Classes on the Northeast Line, so they were sent to other lines, where they were needed more. By 1934, the S-Class was back on passenger trains, as VR needed to improve their public appearance. In doing so, they broke their policy of painting their rolling stock exclusively black, by painting them a nice wagon red. The next year, the S-Class had accelerated services once again. With the line speed being raised, the Sydney Limited was now the fastest train in the Southern Hemisphere. They also held the record for the longest distance without stopping, and that's 209 kilometers between Seymour and Albury. From November of 1937 onwards, the S-Class would haul the most prestigious train in Victoria, the newly rostered Spirit of Progress. New video on that soon. A stainless steel and air-conditioned train from Melbourne to Albury, with a connecting train from Albury to Sydney. They were the only passenger loco on VR with enough power to take an 11-car, 544-ton long train unassisted over the 1 in 50 gradients between Melbourne and Albury. To appear more modern, all of the S-classes were streamlined. S301 as early as February of 1937. The cladding drastically altered their appearance, and the tenders were also modified, holding more fuel, allowing them to do the 106-kilometer stretch without stopping. Then, S302 was soon modified in August, and S300 and S303 followed suit in March of 1938. The four S-classes were also given names, reflecting figures in early Victorian history. These being S300, Matthew Flinders, S301, Sir Thomas Mitchell, S302, Edwin Henty, and S303, Charles Latrobe. On the initial demonstration train from Melbourne to Geelong, miraculously, S303 set an official Australian rail speed record of 127 kilometers per hour. A minor change to the streamliners was their cowcatchers were all replaced with a lace type. It was found that the original cowcatchers would create a vacuum behind them and would trap dust and debris. At the near end of their lifespan, they were converted to oil firing in February of 1951 onwards. The scarcity of mainland coal and the unsatisfactory performance of the locomotives when using coal from other fields began to affect their performance and running schedules. These modifications would change their proportions slightly. The S-Class is a 462 and VR's first ever 3-cylinder locomotive, inspired by Sir Nigel Gresley's A1s. Although it does possess some American designs, such as a bar frame design rather than a plate frame design, and a Delta trailing truck, it also incorporates all 3 cylinders and smokebox saddle into the single 5.5 long ton casting. That was only possible because a set was placed in the axle of the leading driving wheel, thus allowing all 3 cylinders to be in the same horizontal plane. The horizontal plane had a benefit of avoiding many of the middle cylinder problems that beset Gresley's Pacifics. With a top speed of 144 kilometers per hour, they were able to cut train speed by half an hour, formerly hauled by A2s. The first prototype delivered was S300. Initial testing only revealed that the engine was relatively average for an engine of that size. Digging deeper, a study revealed that insufficient valve travel and narrow port openings were impairing the performance. And based on that study, improvements were made to the 3 other S-classes that followed, which basically meant increasing the valve gear and port sizes. The first Delta trailing truck installed on S300 was prone to jumping off the tracks or knocking the rails out of position when going around sharp corners. Once all the issues were fixed and more S-classes were ordered, one member of the class, S303, received VR's new modified front ends, which reduced drafting and increased the S's horsepower from 1,160 kilonewtons to 1,430 kilonewtons at 40 kilometers per hour. Smoke deflectors were fitted the following month to compensate for the reduced uplift of smoke from the redesigned exhaust. And between 1935 and July of 1936, the remainder of the classes were similarly upgraded. The boilers were also modified to include a combustion chamber, arch tubes, and thematic synthons. Don't know what they are? Well, too bad. But unlike its close relative, the X-Class, They didn't receive a Bell Pair firebox. During dynamometer testing in 1937, S301 reached a maximum output of 2,300 drawbar horsepower, or 1,720 kilonewtons at 37 kilometers per hour. I mentioned the problem with the middle cylinder on the A1s. Well, the issue with that was the crank pin bearing over the cylinder was directly beneath the steam chest and steam boiler, where it would be subdued to great temperatures, which would cause them to seize up, which was made worse when the locos were streamlined, reducing ventilation, which would make the hot air circulate around and around. The issue was fixed when VR switched to using a more heat-resistant grease. The S's had a 23-ton axle load, restricting them to only main lines. They weighed 194 tons running on coal, or 223 tons running on oil, 112 tons running on coal, and 140 tons running on oil without a tender. They were 24 meters long while on coal and 26 meters long while running on oil. They could hold 9 tons of coal or 9,000 liters of oil. They had a boiler pressure of 200 psi and a heating surface of 342 meters squared, while on coal, and 346 meters squared while on oil. Either Gresley or Walshart's valve gears would be used on them, and they had a total tractive effort of 185 kilonewtons at 85% boiler pressure. In September of 1933, S301 snapped the driving axle while traveling at speed, pulling the 4 p.m. Albury Express, which caused the middle left driving wheel of the loco to separate from the locomotive. There were no casualties, but the loco suffered extensive damage to the frames and lower boiler. This incident made VR redesign the S's axles. September 1935. 2 S-classes were transferring several carriages, one behind the other, when one of the S-classes ran into the rear guard's van, causing a fatal injury to the guard. August 1952. S301 was running through Aurora at speed when it crossed the Scott Street level crossing, when it then proceeded to smash into a circus car parked on the tracks at full speed, killing 3 people and severely damaging the front of S301. It was repaired with a semi-streamlined appearance, with a non-streamlined smoke box and a steel-sloped cowcatcher. Unfortunately, the S-Class was the first in line for the scrap heap. As they could only operate on the Northeast Line, they were made redundant in 1952, as soon as the B-Classes were introduced. They were also getting more and more expensive to overhaul and maintain due to their age. The first to go was S301, which was in the most accidents, and had severely worn cylinders. It was withdrawn in September of 1953, and scrapped in October that year. Usable parts were kept to maintain the other S's, but the end was near. After trials of the B-Class on the Spirit of Progress was a success, in 1954 the locos were rapidly withdrawn and scrapped, with S302 being recorded as scrapped on the 2nd of July 1954, S303 being recorded as scrapped in May of 1954, and in June of 1954, the last example, the class leader S300 was withdrawn, being recorded as scrapped 3 months later. on the 17th of September 1954. Thus ends Pacific Express engines on Victorian railways. Unfortunately, no S-classes survive into preservation. Despite them being a prominent figure in Australian rail history, none were preserved, although one was going to be set aside for preservation. However, they were all scrapped before the preservation movement really took off. The Australian Historical Railway Society vowed to never lose another steam locomotive class ever again, and then established the ARHS Museum at Newport. Although the locomotives were useless to VR, their tenders weren't, and they found new life as weed sprayers for VR. The tender frames and bogies were converted to QH heavy-duty flat wagons, and one of the oil tanks retrieved from the S-Class tenders was used in April 1954 to convert an R-Class, that being R748, to oil firing. A couple of the tender frames are also preserved, and are being used as flat wagons in Newport workshops, VFGA3 and VFGA4. One tender frame and one tank is stored by Steam Rail Victoria. The fourth and final tender frame is in the care of the Seymour Heritage Centre, which now has a tender body placed on it. All four S-Class names have also been carried over to the S-Class diesels. Fortunately, all of them survive either stored or in operable condition. One of the S-Class whistles survives, as ARHS placed it on R707 when the 50th anniversary of the Spirit of Progress tours happened. Their plates also survive at Newport Railway Museum. The S-Class was one of the most elegant express engines on the Victorian network. Unfortunately, due to not enough interest, none survived into preservation. But, with its sacrifice, all other classes of steam engine on VR survives today, minus the one.